Scary telling.
My husband and I decided to take a weekend getaway to a cabin in the woods. It was supposed to be a relaxing trip away from the city, just the two of us. As soon as we arrived, I felt uneasy. The cabin was isolated, with no neighbors in sight. The sun was setting, and the woods around us were getting darker by the minute. My husband tried to reassure me, telling me that we were going to have a great time and that nothing was going to happen to us. We settled into our cabin, and after a while, my husband suggested we go for a walk outside. As we walked, he wrapped his arms around me, and I felt safe for a moment. But then, something strange happened. He embraced me from behind. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear. Another pair of hands embraced me, and another, and another, and another. I couldn't see who or what was holding me. I struggled to break free, but the grip of the unseen hands was too strong. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel my husband's body tense up behind me. He couldn't see what was happening either. Suddenly, the embrace ended, and we were left standing alone in the woods. I turned to my husband, and he looked just as scared as I was. We hurried back to the cabin, locked the doors, and turned on all the lights. We tried to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was a prank or a weird natural occurrence. But deep down, we both knew it was something more sinister. That night, I barely slept. Every creak and rustle in the woods outside made me jump. And when I did manage to close my eyes, all I could see were the hands that had embraced me and the feeling of being trapped. The next morning, my husband went outside to see if he could find any clues about what had happened. But there was nothing out of the ordinary. The woods were peaceful and quiet, just like any other day. We decided to cut our trip short and head back home. But as we were packing up our things, I found a note slipped under the door. It was written in a shaky, almost unreadable script. It read, "You can run, but you can't hide. The embrace is always waiting for you." My husband and I were terrified by the note, but we didn't know who had left it or what it meant. We quickly gathered our things and left the cabin, eager to get back to the safety of our home. But as soon as we got in the car, things started to feel off. The air was thick with tension, and we both felt like we were being watched. We tried to brush it off and focus on the road, but then we heard a strange noise coming from the back seat. It sounded like breathing, slow and steady. We turned around, but there was no one there. Just the empty back seat and the sound of breathing getting louder and louder. My husband tried to pull the car over, but it wouldn't stop. The brakes wouldn't work, and the car seemed to be driving on its own. That's when we saw them. Dozens of hands reaching out from the darkness and trying to grab us. We screamed and fought, but it was no use. The hands were too strong, and they pulled us into the darkness. When we woke up, we were in a strange room. The walls were covered in blood, and there were chains hanging from the ceiling. We were trapped, with no way out. And the embrace was waiting for us, with more hands than we could count. We tried to break free from the chains, but they were too strong. The room was soundproof, and no one could hear our screams. Days turned into weeks, and we lost track of time. We were trapped in that room, with no food or water. We were slowly losing our minds. And then, something strange started to happen. The embrace became less aggressive, almost comforting. It was like the hands were trying to lull us into a false sense of security. My husband started to succumb to the embrace, letting the hands envelop him and take him away. But I knew I couldn't give in. I had to find a way out. I searched the room for anything that could help me escape. And finally, I found a loose brick in the wall. I pulled it out, and behind it was a small tunnel. I crawled through the tunnel, not knowing where it would lead me. But I had to try. I couldn't stay trapped in that room forever. When I finally emerged from the tunnel, I was in a different room. It was bright and sunny, with flowers on the walls and a soft breeze blowing through the window. I couldn't believe it. Had I finally escaped? But then I saw them. The hands reaching out from the walls and the floor. They were still there, waiting for me. I knew then that the embrace would never truly let me go. It would follow me wherever I went, always waiting to pull me back into its grasp. And so, I am writing this now, as a warning to others. Beware the embrace. It will find you, and it will never let you go. It's been 4 years since our son, Joey, passed away. It still feels like yesterday. My wife, Sarah, and I are struggling to get over it. We have been seeing a therapist, taking medication, and trying everything to move on. But the grief and pain never seem to go away. One thing that has been bothering us is that we can hear Joey crying at night. We know it's not possible, but we both hear it. It's like he's still here with us, crying for us to comfort him. But we know that's not the case. We have tried everything to ignore it, but it's getting harder and harder. We've tried to sleep with earplugs, listening to white noise, and even sleeping in different rooms. But nothing seems to work. One night, Sarah and I decided to investigate where the sound was coming from. It led us to Joey's room. We haven't been in there since he passed away. It's been locked, and we haven't had the heart to go inside. But tonight, we decided it was time. As we opened the door, we were hit with the smell of decay. It was like something died in there. We turned on the lights and looked around. Everything was the way we left it, except for one thing. Joey's crib was moving on its own. We both froze, staring at the crib in disbelief. It was like Joey was still there, rocking himself to sleep. But we knew that wasn't possible. We walked closer to the crib, and the crying got louder. It was like Joey was right in front of us. Then, out of nowhere, the crib stopped moving, and the crying stopped. We looked at each other, wondering what was happening. It was like something was trying to communicate with us. But what? We decided to leave Joey's room and go back to our bedroom. But the crying continued, and it was louder than ever before. It was like Joey was following us, pleading for us to come back to his room. We tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. We decided to go back to his room and investigate further. As we entered the room, the smell of decay was stronger than before. It was like something had died in there recently. We looked around the room, and nothing seemed out of place, except for the crib. It was still moving, but this time it was more violent. It was like someone was shaking it from the inside. Suddenly, we heard a voice. It was Joey's voice, but distorted and inhuman. It was like something was possessing him. We couldn't believe what we were hearing. It was like a nightmare come to life. The voice said, "Why did you leave me alone? Why did you let me die?" It was like Joey was blaming us for his death. We tried to explain that we did everything we could, but the voice kept getting louder and angrier. Suddenly, the crib stopped moving, and the voice stopped. We looked at each other, wondering what had just happened. It was like we were in a trance, and we couldn't snap out of it. We decided to leave Joey's room and go back to our bedroom. But the crying continued, and it was louder than ever before. It was like Joey was following us, pleading for us to come back to his room. The following night, we were both hesitant to go to sleep. We knew that the crying and haunting would continue. But we were tired and needed rest, so we decided to try and get some sleep. As we were dozing off, we heard the crying again. But this time, it was different. It was like there were more voices, whispering and chanting in the background. It was like we were hearing something we weren't meant to hear. We both got up and went to Joey's room again. This time, the crib was still, but the room was colder than before. It was like the temperature had dropped drastically. We could see our breath as we spoke. Suddenly, the crib started moving again, but this time it was different. It was like someone was pushing it from the outside. The crying got louder, and the voices got more sinister. We decided to leave the room, but the door wouldn't budge. It was like it was locked from the outside. We both started panicking, trying to force the door open. Suddenly, the door swung open, and we saw something we would never forget. It was Joey, but he wasn't the same. His eyes were dark, and his skin was pale. He was staring at us with a blank expression. We both froze, not knowing what to do. Then, Joey spoke. He said, "You shouldn't have left me alone. You shouldn't have let me die. Now, you'll never leave me alone again." Then, Joey disappeared, and the room was filled with a deafening silence. We looked at each other, wondering if we were hallucinating or if it was real. But we knew it was real. We had just witnessed something that defied explanation. We decided to call a paranormal investigator to help us understand what was happening in Joey's room. We didn't believe in ghosts or anything paranormal, but we knew that something was not right. The investigator arrived, and we explained everything that had happened in Joey's room. She listened carefully and decided to conduct an investigation. She set up cameras and audio devices all around the room. That night, we left the investigator alone in Joey's room. We went to sleep in our bedroom, hoping that we wouldn't hear any crying or chanting. But that night, the crying was louder than ever before. It was like Joey was screaming for us to come back to his room. We got up and went to his room, but the door was locked again. We knocked on the door, but there was no answer. We started panicking, wondering if the investigator was okay. We decided to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the door opened on its own, and we saw something that we would never forget. The investigator was lying on the floor, unconscious. But she wasn't alone. There was something standing over her, something dark and sinister. We both froze, staring at the entity in disbelief. It was like something was controlling it, using it as a vessel. Then, the entity spoke, using the investigator's voice. It said, "You shouldn't have come back. Joey is mine now. He will never leave me alone." Then, the entity disappeared, leaving us in shock and horror. We tried to revive the investigator, but she was already gone. It was like the entity had taken her soul. From that night on, we never went back to Joey's room. It was like we were being haunted by something that we couldn't explain. We moved to a different house and tried to forget everything that had happened. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, we can still hear Joey's crying. And we know that the entity is still out there, waiting for us to come back to Joey's room. I never thought I'd be a mother to a child with pica. It's been 7 long years since my son was diagnosed with the condition, and it still feels like a never-ending battle. Pica is a disorder where people crave and eat non-food items such as dirt, rocks, and even paper. It's a nightmare, to say the least. My son's case is particularly severe, and we've had to deal with him ingesting all sorts of strange objects, from coins to marbles. We've had to be vigilant about keeping things out of his reach and monitoring his every move. But despite our best efforts, accidents still happen. Yesterday, I found him throwing up coffee grounds. I was perplexed because I keep them on the third shelf of the pantry, way out of his reach. How did he manage to get them? I asked him, but he just mumbled something incoherent and complained of a burning throat and dizziness. I spent the rest of the night cleaning up the mess and trying to calm him down. But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was not quite right. I brushed it off as my imagination, but little did I know that things were about to take a terrifying turn. The next morning, I woke up to find my son still asleep. It was unusual because he's usually up early, eager to start his day. I went to check on him, and to my horror, I found him covered in a cold sweat, shivering and trembling. I called out his name, but he didn't respond. I panicked and rushed him to the hospital, where they told me that he had ingested something toxic. They weren't sure what it was, but his condition was critical, and they had to put him on life support. As I sat beside his hospital bed, tears streaming down my face, I couldn't help but blame myself. I should have been more vigilant. I should have been more careful. I should have protected him better. But the worst was yet to come. Late that night, as I was drifting off to sleep in the hospital room, I heard a strange sound coming from the corner of the room. It sounded like someone whispering, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I looked around, but there was no one there. I brushed it off as my imagination and tried to go back to sleep. But then, the whispers got louder, and I realized that they were coming from my son's bedside. I got up and walked towards him, and that's when I saw it. The coffee grounds he had thrown up the night before were scattered all over his bed, forming strange symbols and patterns that I couldn't understand. I tried to brush them off, but they wouldn't budge. They seemed to be stuck, almost like they were alive. And that's when I knew that something was terribly wrong. Over the next few days, my son's condition only seemed to worsen. Doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with him, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that there was something more going on. Every night, the whispers would return, and the strange symbols made of coffee grounds would appear on his bed. I tried to tell the doctors, but they brushed it off as delirium caused by his illness. But I knew better. There was something sinister at play, and I was determined to find out what it was. One night, as I was watching over my son, the whispers started again. But this time, they were clearer, and I could make out what they were saying. They were calling out my name over and over again, in a voice that was not human. I looked around, but there was no one there. The room was silent except for the sound of the machines keeping my son alive. And that's when I noticed something odd. The coffee grounds on his bed had formed a word. It was my name. I tried to brush it off as a coincidence, but deep down, I knew that something was terribly wrong. I started to investigate, digging through every inch of my son's room, looking for clues. That's when I found it. Hidden in a corner of his closet was a strange object, unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was a small statue made of a dark, twisted metal, with strange symbols etched into its surface. And that's when I realized that this was not just a case of pica. My son had unwittingly stumbled upon something far more sinister. I did some research on the strange metal statue I had found, and what I discovered was deeply unsettling. It was an ancient artifact, believed to be cursed, and said to bring doom to whoever possessed it. I knew I had to get rid of it, but I didn't know how. Every time I tried to throw it away, something stopped me. It was almost like the statue had a mind of its own and was determined to stay with us. And then, things started to get even weirder. Every night, as I sat by my son's bedside, I would hear strange noises coming from the hallway outside his room. It sounded like something was scratching at the door, trying to get in. I thought it was just my imagination, but then one night, I saw it. The door handle was turning, slowly but surely, as if someone or something was trying to open it. I jumped up and rushed to the door, but when I opened it, there was no one there. And that's when I realized that we were not alone in this hospital room. The curse of the metal statue had followed us, and it was determined to claim us both. But I refused to let it win. I gathered all my strength and confronted the curse head-on. I prayed, I pleaded, I begged for it to leave us alone, and slowly but surely, the strange occurrences started to fade away. My son's condition improved, and we were finally able to leave the hospital. But the memory of that cursed metal statue will haunt me forever. It's a reminder that sometimes, the things we fear the most are the things that are closest to us. And sometimes, the only way to overcome that fear is to face it head on, no matter how terrifying it may be.